Hello and welcome. My name is Amber, and last year, at the end of every month, I made a note of my favourite read of that month. And in my last video, I shared those with you. But I also made a note of my worst book of each month, and today I'm going to share them with you. So first, I'll go through which book was my worst read for each month, and then I'll pit them against each other to find out which my worst read overall was. And then I will go through a few dishonourable mentions, which are books that weren't the worst read of the month, but that I felt were worth mentioning. So there is one thing that is worth mentioning, and that is that although some of these books may have been the worst read of the month, that does not necessarily mean that I didn't like the book, or that it was a bad book. It would just mean that compared to the other books I read that month, they didn't hold up. But here are the books. So in January, my least favourite read of the month was How to Kill Your Family by Mackie. And this is one of the books that, although it was the worst book of the month, it was still a book that I enjoyed, and it wasn't a bad book. It just wasn't anything special. So as this was the first book that I read last year, I don't remember it very well. It's a thriller and is about Grace, who is telling us how she killed her family and the reasons behind why she did it. It's definitely easy to understand why she doesn't like her family, who are definitely a family by blood and blood alone, though they probably didn't deserve to die either. But as we are in Grace's head, we can understand why she's doing what she's doing. And her family is quite a shitty family, but at the end of the day, is she any better? It's been too long since I read the book for me to say whether she was or not. And I don't really remember my thoughts on the book that well. I do remember growing bored for a bit. So in February, my least favourite book was This Is Not a Kid's Book, Sleepover, and that is by Andrew Racho and illustrated by Windendra AD. This is a picture book for adults, and I rated it 1 star. It's about kids having a sleepover, except there is one adult there who shouldn't be there. He wants to do drugs, and in a game of truth or dare, he picks truth and discloses that he is a murderer. My thoughts for this book can be summed up with a single meme. In March, my least favourite book was Heads Will Roll by Joss Winning. I listened to this on audiobook, and it is a slasher book set at a camp. This camp is for celebrities who are going to this retreat to get away from social media and technology, quite often because of certain things they've done. Like, for instance, our main character is going there after tweets led to her being cancelled. Then at this camp, people start going missing, and they have the usual camp legends that may not purely be legends. I rated it 3 stars. It was okay, but it was also a really standard slasher with nothing that made it stand out. It was just okay. Then in April, my least favourite was Song of Souls, a Pied Piper retelling by Skye MacKinnon. This one I rated 2 stars. It did start off well, and I was interested at the beginning, but by the end, I didn't care, and I wasn't paying attention. Now, I did listen to this on audiobook, and I find, although I do enjoy audiobooks, there are times when they really don't work for me. And it's hard to then work out whether I didn't like the book because of the book, or if I didn't like it because I was listening to it on audiobook. And this was one of those times. It is about Autumn, who is running away from a cult because she saw something that she shouldn't have seen. She is discovered by a man who only she can see, and it turns out that this is the Pied Piper. And there's not really that much else I can say about it, because again, I found it difficult to pay attention. And again, I don't know if that was because I was bored of the book, or if it was just the audiobook that bored me. In May, my least favourite was Goddess of the River by Vaishnavi Patel. This is about Gagne, the goddess of the river, who was cursed to become mortal. And it's a story that takes place over quite a long period of time, so we see the consequences of her actions as a mortal, as well as the consequences of her actions when she is not mortal. When I first started reading this, I was really interested in it, and I found that the writing style was quite poetic in ways. But then as the plot progressed, I started to get bored. And I think a big part of this is because although I connected with Gagne, the story isn't all about her. Quite a lot of it is to do with her son and what happens to him on Earth. and while that is going on, we are mostly watching it from her point of view, although we also see parts of it from his point of view. And I didn't connect to him or any of the other characters, just Gagne. Now, I do wonder whether I would have enjoyed this book more had I been more aware of the source material, as this is a retelling of the epic poem Mahabharata, specifically the Kurukshetra. Now, I have tried to get the pronunciations correct with this book, but I'm not too sure on how well I have done. I had never heard of this epic poem until I started reading this, and I also have little knowledge of Hinduism and the historical context behind it either, and I feel without that background knowledge it made it a little harder for me to understand the context around what was going on. So although I rated the book 2 stars, it's possibly a me thing and not a book thing. So in June, my least favourite book was Let's Get Digital, How to Self-Publish and Why You Should by David Gaughran. Again, this was one of the times when there's nothing wrong with the book. In fact, I found it quite useful. It was just that I read better books within that month. In fact, I think in June, every book that I rated was 4 stars, which made it a bit more difficult to pick a worst book of the month. So this is a non-fiction book about self-publishing. It had a lot of useful information in it, and it was written in a style that was easy to understand, easy to absorb, and also a little entertaining. I did read a similar book a few months later, and although that book didn't make my worst books of the month, I actually liked it less than this one. And I guess that's where the worst book of the month falls down a bit on whether the worst book of each month are actually the top 12 worst books. In July, my worst book was The Excitements by C.J. Wray. And again, this wasn't because I didn't like the book, it was simply not the best book of the month. I feel that I should also point out that this was a blind date with a book, and it's probably one that I wouldn't have picked up on my own. It is about 2 sisters, Josephine and Penny, who are receiving awards for their contribution to the war effort during World War II. I think it is set in 2020. We have 2 timelines. We have a present timeline, which is told from their nephew's point of view, and it was quite interesting seeing that point of view, where he doesn't know that much about their lives, and then the point of view of the 2 sisters, which we see in the previous timeline, which is during and around World War II, and they haven't told their nephew about everything that they did. So he can only guess, whereas through reading this, we learn what they have done and the contributions that they made. And I feel that is quite representative to the people we meet and the people in our lives. Even often people that we know well, are close to, they have lived lives separate from us that we're not aware of. And it was interesting to see this within the book. So unfortunately, it was another book where I didn't really connect to the characters. I think it was about 3/4 of the way through before I started to, and even that was just with one of the characters. And it was at that point that I started to enjoy the book a bit more. I think being able to connect to the characters has a huge effect on whether I enjoy the book or not. But like many of the books on the list, this was okay, but it was nothing special. Then in August, my least favourite read was King of Wrath by Huang. This was the first in the Kings of Sin series, and I had been really looking forward to it, as the year before I had listened to the Twisted series on audiobook and really enjoyed all of them. And the Kings of Sin series is linked to that as they have some overlapping characters. But unfortunately, I was disappointed, and it is perhaps that disappointment that caused me to put this as the worst read of the month. So this book is about Vivian and Dante, who are heading towards an arranged marriage. This arranged marriage has been set up because Vivian's parents are blackmailing Dante, but Vivian isn't aware of this. Neither of them like each other, although the sexual chemistry is obvious. I do believe that every Anna Huang book I've read has followed the same pattern, and I can't work out whether that is the reason why I didn't enjoy this book as much as the others, as it's quite possible that I'm getting bored of this, or it could be that I just didn't like this book. I guess one way to find out would be to read the next book, which I do plan on doing at some point, but I don't have any concrete plans at the moment. I am hesitantly looking forward to that one, as each book of this series follows a different couple, and the 2 people who are the couple of the second book we meet in the first book, and I actually preferred them than I did the main character in the first book, so that should bode well for me enjoying the second one. Or I could be bored. In September, my least favourite book was The Pumpkin Spice Café by Laurie Gilmore. This is a very popular book that I did not like. It's about Jeannie, who moves to a small town to run a pumpkin spice cafe, which her aunt has left her. There she meets a farmer, Logan, whose last relationship was the talk of the town. Both these characters are not interested in a relationship, but everyone can see that there is something between them and starts to try and push them towards each other. There didn't seem to be any plot in this other than their romance, and as it was quite obvious from the very beginning that they were going to be together, it meant that I was very uninterested in the plot, as there seemed to be no stakes. And I do think this is marketed as cozy fantasy, and cozy fantasy is pretty much characterised by being low stakes. But in the case of this book, I was just bored, as there was very little conflict and nothing really happened. My least favourite book in October was The Library at Hellebore. This is by Cassandra Khaw and is about a woman attending the Hellebore Technical Institute for the Gifted. This is a school for students who are dangerously powerful, such as people who can kill with a touch, or people who are prophesied to bring about the end of the world. After graduation, the students are supposed to move on to better things and are often in places of power. However, on graduation, our main character, Alessa, and her friends discover that that is not the case, and what is actually going to happen is that the staff are going to eat them. So the premise of this book I found interesting, and the first chapter really hooked me in, as in the first chapter, Alessa wakes up to find herself covered in the torn apart remains of her roommate, who she'd killed the night previously. And what quite interested me with this is the reaction of those around her, and how they viewed it as very normal, and didn't villainise her or anything. However, I soon became bored. A lot of this book reminded me of a dream, where you've got quite a few scenes that don't make sense if you start to look at them closely and don't really connect to each other. It has two timelines. One of them is graduation and them trying to get away from the teachers. And the second timeline jumps between different times and it's basically Alessa's experience at the school. But I feel that how that was done meant that we didn't really get to know the characters. And as mentioned previously, when I don't connect to the characters, I don't connect to the book. And to be able to connect to a character, we need to get to know them in some way. And that just really didn't happen in this book. In November, my least favourite was Sociopath by Patric Gagne. And again, this was one of the occasions that, though it was the worst book of the month, it was not a bad book at all, and I actually enjoyed it. I think in November, it was another month where I rated most books 4 stars, but I think I rated this 3 stars, although it was a high 3 stars. So this is the memoir of Patric Gagne, who is a sociopath. It explores what it means to be a sociopath and also combats some misconceptions of it, which is especially important as the term sociopath is often used to villainise people. As well as being a sociopath, Patric Gagne is also a therapist, and she's done extensive research into sociopaths because they are little understood and they're a group of people who others haven't taken the time to research. And through doing this research, gaining a better understanding means that they can be better helped, and that helps both the sociopaths and helps the people around them as well, and society as a whole. This was a really interesting book, but I did find myself growing a little bored around 3/4 of the way through. That's fairly common for me when reading memoirs, although it doesn't always happen, but I think overall I did enjoy it. And finally, my least favourite book in December was The Bewitching by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. So I had been really looking forward to this book, as I enjoyed Silver Nitrate by her, but I was really disappointed, and I think only the ending saved this book from being a 2-star. I rated it 3 in the end. The Bewitching is about Minerva, who is a graduate student researching the life of Beatrice Tremblay, who wrote a horror novel inspired by her friend's disappearance. In a separate timeline, we also follow this author on the lead up to her friend's disappearance. And in a third timeline, we follow Minerva's grandmother as a teenager when her family is cursed by a witch. Links between the 3 timelines start to emerge, and Minerva starts to realise that she could be in danger. This is a slow-moving plot, but I found for myself it was a bit too slow, and I became quite bored. I enjoyed Minerva's timeline, but I wasn't so interested in the timeline of the other 2 characters, and found that I didn't really care about them. I was expecting the book to be quite atmospheric, but I found that I didn't really get that. It's possible that that was because I was so bored with it, rather than it not being atmospheric, as I'm sure I've seen other people say that it was, but I just didn't find it. So those were the worst books that I read each month of last year. Now it's time to see which was the worst overall. This was a lot easier to work out than the best book of 2025. I pretty much knew before I started comparing them which would be the worst. And I'm interested to know what you think will be the worst. So if you think you know what will be the worst and want to have a guess, feel free to comment and then we can work out whether you're right or not. But let's just get into it. So January and February went against each other. So that was How to Kill Your Family versus This Is Not a Kid's Book. There was no competition here. It was a 3-star book versus a 1-star book. So of course, the 1-star book was my least favourite, which was This Is Not a Kid's Book. March went against April, which was Heads Will Roll against Song of Souls. For this, Song of Souls lost. They were both books that I found quite dull, but I found that Song of Souls was harder to pay attention to, and they were both audio books. May went against June, so that was Goddess of the River versus Let's Get Digital. For that, Goddess of the River lost, or won, dependent on which way you look at it, but it lost as I found it the most boring book. July went against August, so that was The Excitements versus King of Wrath, and this was a harder one to choose, but again, The Excitements lost because it was slightly more boring than King of Wrath. September went against October, so the Pumpkin Spice Café versus the Library at Hellebore. The Pumpkin Spice Café lost, as I just didn't care and there was no stakes to it. November and December went against each other, so that was Socipath versus the Bewitching, and again, the Bewitching lost because it was more boring of the books for me. Then for the next round, This Is Not a Kid's Book went against The Excitements, and This Is Not a Kid's Book lost. Song of Souls went against the Pumpkin Spice Café. This was a very difficult one, but Song of Souls lost. Goddess of the River went against the Bewitching. Again, it was a difficult choice, and Goddess of the River lost. And then finally, I put Goddess of the River in third worst place, Song of Souls in second, and my worst read of the year was This Is Not a Kid's Book, as I just didn't like it, didn't see the point of it, and it was a humour that really didn't resonate with me. It was just not for me. Now, during my best books of 2025, I included a few honourable mentions, which were books that did not secure the best spot for that month, but that I thought were still worth mentioning. So now I'm going to do the same with dishonourable mentions, which are the books that didn't make it to the worst spot of the month, but that I still feel are worth mentioning for me not enjoying them that much. First is The Austere Academy by Lemony Snicket. This is part of the Series of Unfortunate Events series, and although I enjoyed the series as a whole, I did not enjoy this book and rated it 2 stars. Part of this was because I was listening to it on audiobook, and the narrator, not Tim Curry this time, had a particular voice for one of the characters that actually made me feel anger when I heard the voice, because it just grated on me so much. Then A's for Alien, an ABC book by Charles Gould. I might have liked this more had I seen Alien, as it was, I didn't care. The Dark Between the Trees by Fiona Barnett. Hex by Thomas Aldervolt. Think Again by Jacqueline Wilson. Not a bad book, but just a great disappointment. And 50 Shades of Grey by E.L. James. So those were the worst books that I read in 2025. Again, just because they were the worst book that I read that month doesn't mean that they're a bad book, just means that I read better books that month. Apart from, of course, this one, which I just thought was bad. But I am aware that there will be people that disagree with me, but those people are just wrong. So what did you think about my worst books of the year? Do any of you disagree? And what were your worst books of the year? Let me know in the comments. And as always, like this video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more, and I will catch you in the next one.